At dawn, the sea went silent. Villages that had stood untouched for generations were already doomed, though no one yet knew it. From the mist rose black silhouettes of ships with carved dragon heads gliding closer without warning. Bells never rang. No army arrived. By nightfall, the streets would be rivers of fire, the air thick with smoke and screams. The world was about to learn a new kind of terror, one that came from the sea and left nothing behind but ash. In the late 8th century, Europe was unprepared for what came next. Kingdoms rose and fell through familiar patterns of war, treaties, and inheritance. Raids were expected, borders contested, but nothing had trained the continent for enemies who did not come to conquer land, negotiate surrender, or hold territory. They came to erase. The first attacks were dismissed as anomalies. Coastal monasteries vanished overnight. Entire river settlements burned before messengers could flee. Survivors spoke of men who moved with terrifying coordination, who struck without warning and disappeared before retaliation formed. Kings doubted these reports. Priests blamed divine punishment. No one yet understood that a civilization built on walls and routines had met an enemy that required neither. The Vikings did not fight like the armies Europe knew. They did not announce war. They did not wait for spring campaigns or formal declarations. Their longships moved silently across open seas and shallow rivers alike, bypassing fortifications designed for land threats. Cities believed themselves safe behind stone and distance. The Vikings used geography itself as a weapon. When they struck, speed was everything. A harbor would be calm at sunrise and engulfed by noon. Defenders scrambled to organize while fire spread faster than orders. Wooden homes ignited instantly. Roofs collapsed. Smoke blinded archers. Panic did the rest. By the time resistance formed, the city was already dying. These were not chaotic mobs. Viking bands were disciplined, trained from youth to operate in brutal efficiency. Each man knew his role. Some advanced, some sealed exits, others ignited structures deliberately chosen to maximize spread. They did not need to kill everyone. Fire, fear, and collapse did the work for them. For the victims, the terror was psychological as much as physical. There was no negotiation, no ransom large enough to guarantee mercy. Some were killed immediately. Others were taken, bound, and dragged back to ships as the city burned behind them. Survival did not mean safety. It meant exile, slavery, or worse. Word spread slowly, distorted by disbelief. How could entire cities fall in hours? How could warriors appear where no army marched? Rulers blamed each other for failures. Coastal defenses were reinforced too late. Rivers remained open highways straight into the heart of kingdoms. The Vikings exploited every weakness. They learned the rhythms of their enemies, the seasons of worship, the days markets filled. They attacked when people gathered, when escape was hardest, when destruction echoed longest. Burning a city was not only destruction, it was a message carried by survivors. Soon, smoke rose from places that had never known war. The sound of oars became a warning more feared than trumpets. Europe was not facing an invasion, it was facing a method of war designed to terrify, destabilize, and erase, and nothing yet existed that could stop it. As raids multiplied, Europe began to understand that this was not a passing storm. Rivers once seen as lifelines became corridors of death. The Seine, the Loire, the Rhine, each carried longships deep inland, delivering destruction to cities that had never built walls facing the water. Merchants watched smoke rise from horizons they believed unreachable. Faith in distance collapsed. Monasteries were among the first targets, not because of religion, but because of wealth and vulnerability. Isolated, lightly guarded, filled with gold and food, they offered perfect objectives. Monks recorded the horror with trembling hands, describing men who laughed as libraries burned, who shattered relics without hesitation. To the victims, it felt like sacrilege. To the Vikings, it was efficiency. Kings attempted response after response, each one failing differently. Armies marched too slowly. Garrisons arrived to find only embers. Fortifications protected land approaches, while rivers remained exposed. Paying tribute bought temporary relief, but invited return. Each concession taught the raiders how fear could be monetized. The Vikings adapted faster than any defense. They learned which cities paid, which resisted, which fractured internally. They studied politics as carefully as coastlines. When rival lords refused cooperation, Vikings exploited the division, striking one while the other hesitated. Europe's greatest weakness was not military, it was fragmentation. Cities that tried to fight often made matters worse. Militia gathered without coordination. Fires set defensively spread uncontrollably. Civilians fled toward gates that became choke points. Panic magnified destruction beyond the Vikings' own efforts. Firestorms raged through districts never touched by swords. Yet the raiders themselves were not immune to loss. Storms destroyed fleets. Counterattacks occasionally succeeded. But unlike kingdoms bound by territory, Vikings could absorb defeat. They retreated, regrouped, returned elsewhere. Losses did not end campaigns, they redirected them. What truly terrified Europe was unpredictability. A city spared one year, burned the next. A quiet coast erupted without warning. The Vikings did not need permanent occupation to dominate psychology. Fear did the occupying for them. Markets emptied, trade slowed, entire regions stagnated under constant threat. Gradually, fortifications changed. River defenses rose. Chains stretched across waterways. Watchtowers multiplied. But each measure lagged behind the raids it answered. Innovation chased destruction, never catching it. The Vikings had already rewritten the rules of warfare. To them, fire was not chaos, it was strategy. Burning destroyed supplies, erased resistance, and left survivors dependent. A city reduced to ash could not fund armies or rebellion. Destruction created opportunity elsewhere. The raids fed expansion, settlement, and eventual dominance. Europe had assumed war meant armies clashing. The Vikings proved war could mean disappearance. Cities did not fall after sieges, they vanished between dawn and dusk. And as smoke darkened more skies, one truth became clear. Stopping the Vikings required not walls or payments, but a complete transformation of how war itself was understood. By the middle of the 9th century, the Viking threat had evolved from raids into something far more dangerous. What began as seasonal violence hardened into long-term strategy. The longships no longer vanished with autumn winds. They stayed. Winter camps appeared along rivers and estuaries, fortified not with stone, but with ruthless intent. From these bases, the Vikings struck repeatedly, learning terrain, harvest cycles, and local politics with deadly precision. The psychological shift was devastating. Europe could endure attack, it could not endure occupation without conquest. Cities lived under the constant knowledge that the enemy was nearby, watching, waiting. Bells rang at shadows, false alarms exhausted defenders. Real attacks arrived when vigilance failed. Fear itself became a weapon sharpened by time. Kings who once dismissed the raids as barbarian piracy now faced existential crisis. Royal authority weakened as nobles negotiated separately, paying tribute or forming private defenses. Unity collapsed. Each compromise fed the Viking war economy, funding more ships, more warriors, more fire. Gold meant survival, and survival meant expansion. The Vikings understood fire better than any army before them. They burned deliberately, not indiscriminately. Granaries first, storehouses next, homes last. Flames consumed not just buildings, but future resistance. Hunger followed ash. Refugees overwhelmed neighboring towns, spreading panic and disease. One burning city weakened 10 others without a single blade drawn. Accounts describe entire urban centers glowing red through the night, their streets choked with smoke so thick it erased the stars. Wooden roofs ignited in chains, jumping faster than people could run. Wells boiled, stone cracked. Survivors emerged days later into landscapes unrecognizable, their world reduced to charcoal and silence. Religion offered no shield. Churches burned as readily as markets. Altars collapsed beside taverns. To the Vikings, sacred spaces were merely concentrations of wealth and people. The shock of sacrilege cut deeper than loss of life. Faith itself seemed powerless. Chroniclers wrote of divine abandonment, of a world turned upside down. Yet not all encounters ended in annihilation. Some cities resisted long enough to negotiate, others adapted. New walls faced rivers, militias trained year-round, naval patrols emerged where none had existed. Slowly, painfully, Europe began to learn. But learning cost blood, and each lesson arrived too late for those already lost. The Vikings themselves were changing. Raiding leaders became kings. Loot funded settlements in foreign lands. Burned cities elsewhere built halls at home. Violence abroad created stability within. The raids were no longer merely survival, they were statecraft. Fire forged kingdoms as effectively as swords. Children raised amid this expansion knew no world without war. To them, sailing to burn distant cities was tradition, not savagery. Songs celebrated destruction as glory. Reputation traveled faster than ships. Many cities surrendered at the sight of sails alone, choosing tribute over annihilation. What Europe faced was not an enemy it could simply defeat. It faced a system, a culture optimized for mobility, fear, and fire. Every city that burned proved the same lesson again. Static defenses could not stop a moving nightmare. And until that truth was fully understood, the smoke would continue. By the late 9th and early 10th centuries, The Viking world and the lands they attacked were locked in a brutal feedback loop. Each burned city taught survivors how to resist, and each act of resistance taught the Vikings how to destroy more efficiently. Warfare accelerated, refined by necessity. Rivers became highways of terror. Cities built to face land armies found themselves exposed from the water, their strongest walls useless against ships that could appear at dawn and vanish by dusk. Frankish chroniclers describe entire regions emptied not by conquest but by anticipation. Villages abandoned fertile ground to settle on hills or islands, places harder to reach but poorer to live upon. Trade routes collapsed, coinage disappeared from circulation. Economies shrank as people hid wealth or buried it, hoping to return one day. Many never did. The Vikings exploited fragmentation with ruthless intelligence. They learned which rulers hated one another, which bishops hoarded silver, which towns lacked allies. They struck where retaliation was impossible. When armies gathered, the longships were already gone. When defenders relaxed, the sails returned. Time favored the attacker who chose when violence began and ended. One of the most devastating tools was not fire, but reputation. Stories traveled ahead of the fleets, tales of cities erased in hours, of populations slaughtered or enslaved, of resistance punished without mercy. Often exaggerated, these accounts did not need to be accurate, they needed to be believed. Entire cities surrendered without a fight, opening gates to avoid the fate they had heard described in whispers. When resistance did occur, the response was exemplary. Defiant towns were burned completely, not partially. Leaders were executed publicly. Survivors were left homeless among ruins. The message was unmistakable. Survival lay not in courage, but in compliance. Fear became cheaper than war. Yet the Viking war machine carried its own costs. Continuous raiding demanded endless success. Failure meant loss of prestige, mutiny, or death. Leaders who could not deliver loot did not rule for long. Violence was both livelihood and obligation. The system fed on itself, driving ever deeper incursions, larger fleets, riskier campaigns. As generations passed, the line between raider and settler blurred. Burned cities across Europe funded growing towns in Scandinavia and newly claimed lands. Some Vikings chose permanence over plunder, carving out realms in former enemy territory. Ironically, the same warriors who once burned cities now ruled them, enforcing laws to protect the trade they had once destroyed. This transition did not end violence, it redirected it. Former raiders defended their holdings with the same ferocity they once unleashed. Cities rebuilt under new masters, their streets haunted by memory. Walls rose thicker, towers multiplied. Europe hardened itself in response to fire. Clergy began to reinterpret the destruction. What once seemed divine punishment became a test of resilience. Chronicles shifted tone. Where early writers spoke only of terror, later ones spoke of endurance. Survival itself became victory. Still, the scars remained. Beneath rebuilt markets lay layers of ash. Beneath churches rested charred beams from earlier sanctuaries. Every stone city in northern Europe carried a wooden ghost beneath it, a reminder of the age when fire ruled strategy and survival depended on flight. The Viking era did not end in a single battle or treaty. It faded as fear lost its edge,
as cities learned to withstand sudden violence, as the world adapted to the nightmare that once seemed unstoppable. But memory endured. Long after the ships stopped coming, people still watched rivers at dawn, half expecting sails on the horizon.
As defenses improved and kingdoms consolidated, the Viking method evolved once again. Raids grew larger and more coordinated, no longer the work of small bands seeking quick plunder, but of armies pursuing strategic domination. Burning a city was no longer only an act of terror, it became a means of reshaping political reality. A destroyed capital weakened entire regions, forcing rulers into submission, tribute, or alliance. Fire cleared the board for negotiation. Kings across Europe began paying enormous sums simply to be spared. These payments, known later as Danegeld, bought temporary peace at staggering cost. Entire treasuries were emptied to delay destruction. The Vikings understood the leverage perfectly. Why risk battle when fear alone could extract wealth? Cities that paid survived. Those that refused were erased as examples. Mercy became transactional. Some of the most infamous burnings occurred not during surprise attacks, but after negotiations failed. Chroniclers describe moments when envoys returned with refusal and ships immediately moved into formation. What followed was systematic annihilation. Storehouses ignited first, then homes, then religious centers. Flames were directed, not random. Survival was deliberately minimized. Despite the terror, resistance slowly adapted. River chains were stretched to block ships. Watchtowers rose along coasts. Fortified bridges controlled access points. Armies learned to move faster. For the first time, Viking fleets faced coordinated opposition. Battles grew bloodier, outcomes less certain. The age of effortless dominance was ending. Yet even as resistance improved, the psychological damage endured. Children grew up hearing stories of burning nights told by parents and grandparents. Communities carried trauma across generations. Rebuilt cities were planned with fear in mind. Narrow streets to slow attackers, stone construction to resist fire, central strongholds for last stands. Urban Europe was redesigned by Viking flames. Within Viking society itself, the mythology of fire took root. Songs praised cities reduced to embers. Leaders earned reputations through destruction. To burn was to prove worth. Mercy risked appearing weak. This cultural pressure ensured violence persisted even when practical necessity faded. But history is never simple. Alongside fire and slaughter came exchange. Vikings carried ideas, technologies, and trade connections across continents. Iron tools, ship designs, and navigational knowledge spread alongside terror. Burned cities sometimes rose as stronger hubs, rebuilt with lessons learned through catastrophe. Gradually, raiders married into local elites. Their children spoke new languages. Gods were replaced by crosses. Brand bands became landlords. The men who once watched cities burn now taxed them, protected them, and depended on their survival. Violence transformed into governance. Still, the legacy of destruction lingered. Old songs did not disappear. Memories of ash remained powerful tools of control. Even settled rulers invoked their ancestors' cruelty when rebellion stirred. Fear, once unleashed, could be inherited. By the 11th century, Europe stood changed. Cities were stronger,
kingdoms centralized and rivers guarded. The Viking threat no longer defined daily life, but its influence was carved into stone and law. The age of burning cities had passed, but it had reshaped civilization in its image. What remained was a paradox. The very forces that nearly erased urban Europe also forged its resilience. Fire destroyed, but it also forced adaptation. From ash rose stone, and from terror emerged endurance, an unwilling tribute paid to an enemy no one could stop, until history finally caught up.
The final phase of the Viking Age was not marked by a single defeat, but by exhaustion, cultural, economic, and political. The world that had once been easy to terrorize no longer existed. Rivers were fortified, coasts watched, and armies trained specifically to counter longships. Fire still burned, but it no longer guaranteed victory. Each raid demanded greater effort, greater loss, and greater risk. Former raiders now ruled territories that needed stability. Fields had to be planted, taxes collected, trade protected. A city reduced to ash no longer meant profit, it meant famine, unrest, and lost revenue. The logic of destruction began to collapse under the weight of governance. Kings who once gloried in flames now issued laws against unchecked violence. Christianity accelerated this transformation. Conversion was often political, but its effects were real. Burning churches no longer brought honor, it brought condemnation from the very systems Vikings now sought to join. Alliances replaced raids, marriages replaced massacres, oaths replaced terror, though the memory of terror remained close at hand. Yet Europe never forgot what unchecked violence could do. Chronicles written centuries later still lingered on the fires. Monks described cities screaming as one body. Poets recalled skies blackened by smoke. These accounts shaped how later generations understood chaos, invasion, and collapse. The Viking Age became the benchmark for apocalypse. Archaeology confirmed what memory preserved: layers of ash beneath modern streets, charred beams fused into stone, mass graves without names. Every excavation told the same story: sudden violence, overwhelming force, no time to escape. These were not battles, they were erasures. Ironically, many cities that survived Viking destruction emerged stronger than those never attacked. Necessity drove innovation. Stone walls replaced wood. Standing militias replaced peasant levies. Early warning systems linked coast to capital. The modern European city was forged not only by trade and culture, but by fear. The Vikings themselves faded into myth faster than into history. Horned helmets, exaggerated savagery, half-remembered gods. But the truth was more unsettling than legend. These were not monsters, but humans who discovered that terror could be weaponized and perfected it. They understood that fire could conquer where armies failed. When the last great raids ended, there was no celebration, no treaty closed the age of flames. The violence simply thinned, scattered, and dissolved into politics. Former enemies ruled side by side. Descendants of burned cities governed descendants of burners. History absorbed its own horror. Today, tourists walk through quiet medieval streets unaware of what once happened there. Cafes sit atop ash, churches rise where screams once echoed. Civilization has a way of covering its scars, but it never fully heals them. The ground remembers.
The Viking Age did not end because it was defeated. It ended because its methods worked too well and forced the world to change. Entire cities burned alive, and from their destruction emerged a harsher, stronger Europe. No one could stop the flames at first. In the end, only transformation could. And that may be the most terrifying lesson of all, that civilization often survives not by preventing destruction, but by enduring it, learning from fire, and building higher walls from its ashes.